So we should be live.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Um, Welcome to Amana Bible Institute. My name is Corey Brown, and I am the director for leadership, entrepreneurship, and spiritual development. And today we're going to talk really briefly just about just COVID-19. We're going to talk about COVID-19, and we're going to talk about building building in the midst of COVID-19, building community, really in the midst of COVID-19. And so, when we um, think about all of the negative implications of COVID, just kind of talking through. What has COVID looked like for us, right? What are some of the risk factors for COVID? How do we move forward in the midst of COVID, right? Those are some of the things that we want to talk about today. And so I'm here with our founder, and our president, and we're going to move right ahead. Her name is Latoya Leary, so she'll be here on here with me. So let's move right in. We want to jump right into the midst of it, um, and get into what we're doing. All right, so we're gonna talk through love, growing, and serving in the midst of COVID-19. So COVID, um, COVID has really, it's forced us to really to reimagine, right? Um, how we do both ministry and community. And I use the word reimagine because in order to reimagine something, it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of planning, takes a lot of time. We've literally had to use our creative juices to kind of just recreate how we do ministry and how we do community. Um, and this hasn't been an easy thing since COVID-19 really hit the United States. Um, there's so many different types of considerations, right, that we've got to deal with and that we've got to work through in order to just kind of figure out where we are, right? That's one of the biggest questions. One of the biggest things is where we are, right? Even myself, I'm a church planter, and January, February of 2019, my church in I'm sorry, of 2020, January, February of 2020, my church, myself and my leadership, we were planning on planting, right? We were in the midst of getting ready for a plant, and we were trying to figure out, okay, exactly when are we going to start? Are we going to start in April? Are we going to start in May? What are we going to look like? Where are we going to be? What is our facility going to look like? How many folks do we anticipate launching with? And right in the middle, of that, prepping to launch in April, May, all of a sudden, COVID hits, in March, heavy, and there is no church, right? There is no church planting anymore. There is no church as usual anymore. So many churches were really unprepared for this thing. Um, and so they've quickly had to ask themselves these questions. And so these are some considerations. Firstly, um, what has always shaped our communities, right? So when I say communities, that is inclusive of our churches, our organizations, even our businesses. What has shaped our communities, right? What has always shaped our communities? How have we always done things? How have things always been the same, or things have always been similar, or we've always had access to things in the same way, right? um and then compare that to what now shapes our community. What shapes us now, um as a community, when we look at COVID and all these different things? What is shaping us, right? Um how's that changed our organizational structures or our church structures, how we do church? um these are some considerations. How can we live out community, right? So in the midst of that comparison, right? So if we look at how we've always done things, what is shaping how we're doing things now, then we've got to consider how do we live out community in the midst of this change, right? Because we're going through a drastic change, right? So how do we live that out? How do we bring the same life and the same meaning to what we're doing now, as a comparison to what we've done, always done up until 2020. um, and then how do we bring measurement to what we do? So in many times, we brought measurement in various ways, and we'll get into that. We've brought measurement in so many different ways, but a change always requires measuring things differently, right? So when we talk about our communities, when we talk about our churches, we talk about our organizations, how do we bring measurement, right, to what we consider success, quote unquote, to be? How do we bring measurement to what we consider quality, quote unquote, to be? Because now it's extremely difficult to use quantitative measures, right? In order to measure success. But now we've got to use some different meaning, some different methodology, for measurement. So these are some considerations, and this is the stuff that we want to get into. And so I don't want to be too long. I want to be really brief, but we want to jump right into the midst of this. And I want you guys to leave with a couple of things. So, how are we ministering, right? How do we minister in this time of COVID-19, right? We've got to bring consideration to how we minister, and what's important, right? What is important? So, how we minister, we're ministering online. This is one of the biggest methods right now. We're ministering online. We're not touching people anymore, or at least most churches are not. And if you are touching folks, it's probably going to be at a very limited capacity. So we're preaching online, and that in itself brings a ton of different just implications, a ton of different factors that many communities are not prepared for. Many folks are not prepared um, for online, and this is not just church, but even when you think about your families, right? Um, I remember, earlier this year when the pandemic first hit around April. Um, for the first time ever, I had like a Facebook like I think it was a Facebook Messenger kind of conference with my family. First time I've ever done it in my life, right? It was weird, it was surreal. I was talking to my aunts who, some of them were, 15 minutes away. Some of them were uh across the country, and so these things are important, right? Online, this is how we're doing things now. Teleconferencing. I've seen so many people utilize prayer lines and phone lines for various things, various meetings, and some folks have always been doing it. But for many of us, this is a new thing, right? So we're learning what it means to minister in different contexts and through different means. And sometimes those different means completely change our strategies and how we do things, right? And even the feeling, going back to the measurement, the feelings of measurement, right? Because we're no longer in a physical space, we're no longer physically touching people. We're looking at people through computer screens, or we're listening to their voices through speakerphones. So this thing is different. One of the other one of the other things to consider is small group sessions, right? um you know I know here in Michigan, many times during the shutdown, we've had, hey, gatherings of less than 10. So if you have people that you've done things with immediately, um what does it look like to have a small group session? A small group session, or a small Bible study, or a small in-home gathering, where there are less than 10 folks, but we're able to minister to each other through those means. And when I say ministering, I don't mean just preaching. That is inclusive of preaching, but ministering also means just being present with each other. Um, it also means fellowship. So these are things that are important to consider. how we minister virtual meetings with family and friends. And so I just alluded to that. My family and I, we had the very first virtual meeting ever in life, and it was a very very surreal thing. And so um, when we talk about the how, then we've also got to talk about the what. So here are the ways that we're ministering. What are some of the things that we really need to be in consideration of? And this is really kind of getting into the meat of what we want to talk about, is the what, right? What is important, because it's so difficult in many cases to measure what is really important in the midst of this pandemic, right? I'm of the nature of ministering to the total man. And in ministering to the total man, we've got to consider what are some of the most pertinent issues that people are facing right now. So when we consider the what, I think one of the first startling things, and we've seen it, they were talking about it all throughout the election, ministering to heal COVID, the COVID death impact. Is one of the biggest things. When COVID didn't just come to shut us down, but the shutdown came for a reason. Um, drastic numbers, upwards of in the 200,000s of people around just this country alone, that have died from COVID-19. We're not even talking about folks that were diagnosed. We're talking about folks that literally passed away, died. So I think around right now the statistic is right around 2 to 3% of people that are diagnosed with COVID have passed away from that. um, and we see this a lot across the U.S., but particularly in a lot of minority communities. Black and brown people, for example, are really have been really impacted by COVID. And so we've got to understand what it means. I've had a very very close death due to COVID-19, and it was really surreal. And so really ministering to heal COVID death impact is going to be one of the biggest things that churches are really going to have to figure out how they're going to do that, right? Pastors and leaders have got to figure out, families have got to figure out, how do we move past the deaths, right? How do we properly minister and engage folks who have lost people due to COVID-19? Ministering to heal the impact of financial crisis, right? And we see this in many communities, right? We've got certain things like the stimulus packages and things of that nature. But really, when you're talking about the financial crisis of COVID-19, it may seem like a fleeting thing. Well, what are finances, right? That can't be the most important thing. Well, it's not the most important thing. But when you think about the impact of finances on people, um, and you see this now in a more broader spectrum, because you see folks that are small business owners, people that worked in business in an organization. A lot of those people took drastic pay cuts when their businesses shut down or closed temporarily, or when they they had to leave work because the kids schools were closed, or one of the parents was no longer able to work, had to stay home with the children. And so these are all financial implications. And now this is not just in black and brown communities, but now we're expanding it. And you see folks of every race being affected in this way. And I think this is what comes from some of the pushback from some of the state shutdowns, or some of these mandatory things that are brought on by some of the governors. When you think through, um, when you think through this financial crisis, this is where you get some of the people that are protesting, and they're saying, hey, we've got freedom of choice, we got freedom of this and that, because this has impacted their communities. The financial crisis has impacted their communities. So if they're not in urbanized settings, they may see less COVID-19 cases, or they might have seen less COVID-19 deaths. But their businesses are yet and still being shut down. And so these are also going to be folks that the church is going to have to be able to minister to people that are their homes are being foreclosed on, or they're going through all kind of stuff. Their credit cards are being charged off. For the first time they're experiencing what it means to to have financial repercussions due to this COVID-19 pandemic. And so these are very real pertinent issues, and these are going to be the things that needs to be ministered to, coming out of COVID. Ministering to fear. um the pandemic has really brought about a strong, um really just a lack of for better terms, really just this humongous sense of fear. Fear leads to paranoia, and it leads to all these different emotional responses. And we've got to be able to minister to to fear. A lot of people are struggling with their faith, even in this season. And so how do we remain cautious but we dispel fear? And that's going to be a big balancing act. And then ministering to depression is one of the biggest things, especially early on in the pandemic. Moving even into the summer months, I found that a lot of people that I was connected to, a lot of those people were struggling with depression. But pre-pandemic, a lot of that depression was kind of undercurrent. A lot of that depression um, was under the surface, if you will. The pandemic had a way of bringing those underlying issues to the forefront. And so you saw people that experience mental health issues go through mental health crises. Isolation has a way of doing that. And so this is one of the going to be one of the biggest things that we've got to deal with, is really ministering to folks with fear and depression. In the beginning, there were a lot of suicides. There were a lot of reports of mental health breakdowns due to depression. And it was directly correlated with the COVID-19 pandemic. Folks being isolated in their homes was not good for their mental, right? And so these are going to be issues that we as the church, we as a community are going to have to be able to tackle. We've got to understand what it means to deal with these problems, to deal with these issues, and how to effectively minister to folks and to minister to people. So this is what we're doing, and this is why it's important.
I just have some thoughts,
Yeah.
because what seems apparent in this, what's important to minister is, as you kind of hinted, is the who we're ministering to. And it seems pretty clear that what COVID has done is kind of helped us to reveal gaps
Mhm.
within, the body of Christ or religious organizations as a whole, helping religious organizations to think about the people that they have not been servicing. It's
Mhm.
more often the case that religious organizations, especially Christian organizations, we want to see ourselves as universal. We want to see ourselves as having a theology or a doctrine that all people can embrace. But there are so many people who don't actually get to benefit well, or who don't get to, we don't really serve them as we ought to. And so I think that there are some groups that come to mind. So the homeless, for example, right? What happens when everyone is sheltering in place and you have people who don't have a place to shelter? How do we deal with that group of people, that demographic? Um, Also thinking about people who are mentally ill, and then also thinking about gaps in, the type of people we haven't been servicing well because we haven't been having community groups on these particular, subject or topic areas. Marriages have suffered because people are in the house having to deal with the issues that they haven't had to deal with because they've been able to run away in their cars. So there are marriages that are suffering. This shows that there's some information that, or some teachings that probably the church can do a lot better with when it comes to building and ensuring that people have healthy marriages. Singles, right? There are people living alone when the world shuts down, right? You have people who actually don't have a community to go to, you know? So while there are people who can shelter in place with their families, there are some who shelter in place in their homes alone. What do you do? How do you service those people? But also, thinking about the elderly, you know, what happens when, you know, there are older people who live alone and can no longer touch the world, but these are also people who are not in touch with these technological advances that have been made over the past few years. How do you continue doing the work of ministering to those people? So if anything, I think what, for me, what comes out of, you know, the points that you've made here and the things that have to be considered are all of the people that we haven't been considering for a really long time, you know, because we've been kind of sticking with the status quo of going to a building to service people. And maybe we need to think about how we can do things differently now, and also when COVID is no longer a problem.
Absolutely, excellent, excellent input. And those are, those are some of the biggest things, right? What I think, in all that what you said, what really speaks to me is, um we're dealing with a lot of that isolation. And that, I think that kind of sums up a lot of what you said. And that isolation is breeding, right? Breeding different problems and different issues. So we're struggling to really understand how to deal with that. So let's deal with some of the potential opportunities and the potential risks from COVID-19. So for folks that want to grasp what's good, about the, or at least there's nothing, I guess, good about the pandemic, but there are some opportunities in the pandemic. And for me, I think one of the biggest things is having the ability to missionally refocus, right? So to refocus um our strategy, right, as a church, well, as the church, but as organizations and as entities, really refocusing, missionally refocusing, it's going to be one of the biggest things. Here's what it looks like to missionally refocus, right? For so long, we have been we have, our operations rather have been geared towards being internally focused, being attractional, bringing people to us, right? Bringing people to church on Sunday mornings, bringing people to where we are, right? But in order to missionally refocus, what it says is we're no longer going to be inwardly focused, right? But now we're going to be outwardly focused. So we're no longer going to focus on just bringing folks to church on Sunday morning. We're no longer going to focus on the numbers, right? Getting them in, but we're going to refocus outwardly. I think this is the kind of mission and outreach that I think maybe God has probably intended for the church all along. It is to take kingdom into the world, right? So a missional refocus, getting away from the everyday trends of coming to church week by week, on Sunday mornings, to really focus on community exegesis. That's missional refocus. So how do we exegete our communities? Exegeting the communities means going in and figuring out, hey, what does our community need? How can we live out the gospel in these communities? How can we bring the gospel to these communities? And it's not just going out witnessing, knocking on folks' door, saying that Jesus loves them, and that's a part of it. But it's also doing more, right? It's also being the good Samaritan. It's also helping those that are in need, showing love, showing kindness, right? A missional refocus, right, encompasses all of these things. And so I think that this is a big opportunity. This also will help alleviate some of that underlying stuff that's going on, because people are losing hope. And when they lose hope, here's where problems begin to come in. When they feel isolated, here's where problems begin to come in. So this missional refocus can be lived out in so many different kinds of ways. But here's a potential opportunity, and folks really need. churches really need to really think about their strategic process, and how they can do the gospel in different ways. And this is going to require a different measurement. That's what we were talking about and alluding to earlier. The missional refocusing requires a different measurement, because now it's not just about numbers. Now it's about quality. How can I think qualitatively about what I'm doing, and how can I bring measurement to that? Okay. Growing online presence is a huge thing. This is probably going to be, one of the biggest things for churches, is knowing how to shift, and knowing how to be, be lean, really. And shifting and being lean is a key component to having a growing online presence, marketing and things of that nature. But at the same time, really understanding what it's going to mean, to do ministry, um, and to do it, via distance. How does that look? How does that work? Um, Sad to say, but there are many churches who do not have the capacity for that. Simply because they just have not kept up with modern times, or things of that nature. And so that's going to definitely be a potential risk for churches that aren't able to do that. But for churches that are able to do it, even if there's a learning curve, it poses a great opportunity. Um, More pastoral care, because with the pandemic and churches being shut down, one of the worst things that a pastor can do is, if you're in church, if you're at the church 4 to 5 days a week, 6 days a week, and then the pandemic hits, and you go and sit in an empty church for 4, 5, 6 days a week. And I've seen so many pastors do. I know pastors that have done that. Where are they? Whether they're at the church from 8 to 6, there's nobody there. They aren't having any meetings. They're just sitting at the church and nothing's being done. Well, that time could be spent doing more pastoral care, even if it's distance, or even socially distance, or even if it's virtual. This pandemic presents the opportunity to really be present with people, to understand people, to be intentional with folks. And so here's a better way, a more productive way, to spend your time. And probably that's probably going to be one of the most important things when you're dealing with individuals, is learning how to be intentional, right, about taking care of those people, and not just spending time, doing the same things as if there was no pandemic. And then being intentionally present in our communities. So this is going back to the mission of refocus, but this is a little bit more specific. Really understanding what it means to be intentional about being in the communities, being a part of the communities. We don't have to spend so much time prepping for Sunday morning service, like we did before. We don't have to spend so much time physically. Our travel time is cut. We're not driving 30 minutes, we're not driving 45 minutes or an hour, to get to church or to get home. There's no longer that time gap. There's no longer the same, um, implications, if you will, of having in person um, church services. So the way to refocus that is to be intentionally present, in some of our communities. And so we'll get more into that. But here are some of the potential opportunities. Let's talk about some of the risk factors.
Can I
Um,
just ask a question really quick? And I know you
yeah,
said we'll get into this in the future, so I don't know if I'm cutting in too quickly. But how do we be intentionally present in a society that thinks that presence is about tangibility, like physical tangibility?
yeah.
Like we can't
Mm,
physically touch people anymore because we're not congregating in person, in body.
mhm.
So what are your thoughts on how we can actually work on being present, having presence while not even being in a room, or in the same room?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. you know, for me, um, I have always, and I think this might be the case, and this is what a lot of folks might say, especially pastors or leaders. I've always had a really, really strong connection and personal relationship with my own congregants, especially my leadership team, but really all of my congregants. I've always spent time with them. And so when the pandemic hit, um, it has been, we had to really think about how do we be intentionally present. And I think that there are several ways. And so yeah, we can talk about it, and yeah, we're going to get into it. But um, I think the first thing is understanding that um, there are going to be some implications of not being able to be physically present, right? There are going to be some of those, right? Because for many people, especially extroverted folks, like really extroverted folks like myself, um, being being physical is definitely important. So I think the first thing is acknowledging that, right? But I think on the flip side of that, understanding that there have been some gaps, that even physically, us being present with folks physically, that have been presented. So for example, how many leaders go to church week to week? They preach their message. They spend 2 or 3 days a week prepping for a Sunday morning service. Um, they may spend a day or two prepping for preaching, and then they spend half a day actually in pastoral counseling, let's say. Well, we're cutting most of this meat out, right? We're cutting out most of the meat. You might still have the sermon preparation, but focusing on Sunday morning service has been it just hasn't, the meat just hasn't been there as much, especially during the early months of the pandemic. Right now, we're kind of back to, oh, we'll do 25% of folks can be there, whatever the case might be. But I think in this space, we have had more time to focus with people one on one, and that doesn't have to be in person, right? Um, Via Zoom, we focus with folks one on one. Our team at Amana is a team where many of us have never met each other in person. many of us, many of us are on teams from around the world. You're right. We got folks in Florida, folks in Michigan, folks in Georgia, folks in South Africa, even. But we've been intentional about connecting with each other, right, via social platforms. And this goes back to the growing online presence. This goes back to technological capabilities, right? Embracing the virtual, right? 20 years ago they were saying, or 10 years ago, folks were saying, oh, Facebook is the devil. Now those same pastors are saying, watch me via Facebook Live, right? And this is where we've got to go. Really, being transformational means changing your mind. It means, right, being having a changing of the mind, right? The Bible said, be not conformed to things of this world, be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. So if we take that spiritual concept and we apply it to these natural things, right, change your mind about how you feel about technology, and then you'll see a lot of those concerns will begin to dissipate, right? A lot of people can't move forward because they're in such a box as it pertains to how they do things. And tradition is not always bad, but sometimes tradition can hinder where we're going to move, right? It can hinder our own progression. And this is what we see with a lot of people. This is really the biggest thing and the biggest issue. You don't necessarily have to be physically, and there is a need for physical touch, right? That is even a love language. There is a need for physically being present with people, but I think the more you change your mind, the more you will see that need for physical touch, you can go a lot longer without having it. Not saying that it's not important, not saying that those tenets aren't important, but when you are able to just, I think really the biggest thing is just kind of getting past it in the mind. And when you're able to do that, then I think that you'll begin to see a world of different opportunities open up, via various platforms. Um, I'm in training and development, From a professional standpoint, whenever I do coaching and I do a lot of training and development, most of the time you go into an organization or into a business, or wherever you're doing that training and development is most likely going to have something to do with technology. You're training people on how to use an app. You're training people on a new policy or procedure that requires them to do more tech, or that requires them to learn something that's going to be, a synchronous or an asynchronous platform, right? All of this, it leads to more intentionality, right? um Secondly, and then I'll let you rebuttal, but secondly, I think one of the key things is a lot of pastoral leaders are just not used to they're not used to really loving on people. And that's just the bottom line. A lot of leaders are used to operating from more of an executive kind of space. They're used to operating more, from more of a space of, I'm the preacher and not the pastor, or I'm the executive, or I'm the administrator, and I'm not really the pastor, because the pastorate requires you um to go in depth with how you love on people. And I think the pandemic has been a prime example or prime opportunity for us to live into that even more. I think that a lot of leaders struggle with that because they've never been intentional, or they've never had to be intentional, right? Now you've got to actually pick up the phone and call people if you want to know how they're doing, because you're not seeing their face once a week or twice a week. Now you actually have to schedule a Zoom meeting. You've got to do those things, right? These are things that folks are not used to doing in leadership. And when you're in leadership, you got to be able to be personal with people. So there's so many different ways to come from that. But those are some of the biggest things that I think about, in answering your question.
Yeah, I enjoy your answer actually. I don't really have any rebuttals. I just have thoughts, those thoughts that just storm through my head. Um, so you talk about being intentional and how a lot of people, a lot of pastors aren't really accustomed to being intentional, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to the things that aren't executive or administrative or that has very little to do with preaching. It's the whole charisma, right? This
Mm-hmm.
whole charismatic thing. Um, that the performance, right? The performance occurs on the stage, on the pulpit, right? And somehow it stops there. It doesn't go out into the streets. It doesn't go out into the pews. It doesn't really touch people
Mm-hmm.
outside of when it's not on the pulpit, kind of thing. So I I really like thinking about this, but also you mentioned the need for a transformed mind. And I think pretty solid. One of the things that I've been seeing a lot of people doing, they're doing the same thing they were doing pre-COVID, right? Like they're having services and then they're making them accessible to others through Facebook Live. We were doing that before the pandemic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And watching those services in so many ways for so many people becomes this a similar experience as we would have when we're watching television or we're watching YouTube, right?
Mm-hmm.
Netflix,
Yeah.
Hulu, all those streaming channels. And it doesn't always, there's not always like intention on making sure that the people on the other side of the screen can actually feel like they are present in your service.
This is what we're gonna get into.
Okay.
Oh
Okay.
my God, yes, we're going to get into that.
Well, then I'll hold off because I was actually thinking about the ways in which ABI strives to build community through virtual platforms.
hmm
And we try to use everything in Zoom, including breakout rooms, and using that has really, for me, has been helpful in my own classroom at FSU, making sure that students feel like they can touch one another, even though they don't even know one another.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah,
I'll hold back then.
gotcha. Okay, let's deal with some potential risk, and we'll talk about this for a minute. And this really, you kind of really, what you said just kind of moves into this. So this transition is perfect, because when you think about some of the potential risks, right? We talked about opportunities. Here are some of the risks. um spiritual unfulfillment, right, is the biggest risk that churches one of the biggest, no, the biggest risk in my opinion, um, for a lot of folks when they're dealing with this kind of stuff, especially pertains to the pandemic, because people are not able to come physically to the church. So when we talk about spiritual unfulfillment, you know people can be spiritually unfulfilled with online church as well, right, for all of the things that the reasons that you just mentioned. But really, when you think about it, a lot of people have that need for physical touch, right? um the more and really you see such a gap as it pertains to like the generations. So when you look at baby boomers are the people that are at the highest risk for spiritual unfulfillment, um, due to the pandemic, because of lack of physical space and physical touch as it pertains to church. And this is just because a lot of the times, you know, they've always gone to church every Sunday. It's routine for them. It's tradition, and it's not a bad routine or a tradition. It's just that technology is something that is far from a lot of their minds, right? And as you go down the list, if you're grouping folks by age, that trend, that risk tends to kind of go down a bit. But the spiritual unfulfillment is really there, for many people, never returning to church, right? Because you got a lot of folks in June and in March and May, they were saying, oh yeah, um we're not coming back till January. Well, they were predicting back then that we were going to have a second wave. So in January, it's unlikely that we'll be through COVID or that numbers will be down. Numbers will probably still be up. So those same people are going to say, oh, we're not going back till next June, right? And then so what happens is you've got a whole set of people who have been out of church for over a year. Um, they may never come back, or they may have gotten to the point where they're like, oh man, like I can do this for another 2 years. This is a real risk that I think that a lot of people aren't considering. This might really be the case for a lot of younger folks. So this might be more of a risk that you see kind of going up in ascending order, from so spiritual unfulfillment in a descending order, and then folks never returning to church in an ascending order. And so that's how I look at things. These are things that we're going to have to deal with, and I think that, even in the midst of this, there are ways to kind of mitigate some of these risks. Um, I think one of the deeper things that churches are not, especially attractional, and I have nothing. There's nothing wrong with being an attractional church, but really having the capacity to minister to broken people, right? And this kind of goes back to what you've alluded to, I think, in a way, because when we talk about making folks feel like they're present, also has to do with the content of the word that we preach. How we're doing things, it goes back to being missionally focused. It goes back to having the capacity to be fluid, right, being able to be adaptable and being able to adjust. Also dealing with the content of our messages and our preaching. We need to have the capacity to minister to broken people, right? These folks in this pandemic, even now, but you will see, and you'll see it when we come off of this. You're gonna have people that come to church that've never been to church before, and they're gonna be going to Bedside Baptist, or such and such, because they're gonna be looking for a word. They're gonna need a word because folks have died. They're going to be looking for a word because their cars have been repossessed. This is real. Come on now. Their businesses have been shut down. I drove down the street. When my computer was messed up and I needed to get a computer repair. I live in an affluent area in the state, and I drove down the street and I called the number and they said, yeah, unfortunately, we're no longer in service. We had to shut down due to COVID-19 permanently. They shut down. This is real. People are losing it. You know, Folks are unemployment. That extra assistance was there, but now people are just living off the unemployment. And so when you think about all of this stuff, folks, some people that have had COVID, some of them that have survived with underlying health risks, those health risks have come to the surface. So you are going to have to be able to minister to a broken people, and you can't just be preaching that, a lot of this happy go lucky stuff that we're preaching. We've got to really be able to get into the meat of the word, and go past the milk. And this is where churches and leaders and teaching pastors and preachers are going to have greater levels of capacity, because they're going to be have to be able to preach to a broken people. And if you're not able to do that, those people are going to go to another church, or they're going to say, you know what, I'm done with this, and they're not going to come back to church, right? So these are some of the potential risks that I see.
I looked at these bullet points and I thought two things. Not coming back to what, right? In that middle point.
Yeah.
Because if I'm to be completely honest, that's me.
Yeah.
I am not going back to church if the way that it was, yesterday. I'm not returning to that.
Yeah.
Like, so if churches want to stay open and they want to keep their um membership numbers increasing, we have to do something different.
Yeah.
Our churches are not going to thrive off of what we were doing in 2010 or 2015, or let's just put it early 2020, or
Yeah.
even right now. Like, we have to be a, transformational like body of believers who are willing to like move with the times,
Yep.
believing that, God and the things pertaining to God and the things pertaining to the people of God, these are things that are temporary. They're things that are lasting. They are things that will survive through the ages, survive through changes like this, right? I feel like there's that tendency to to have this doubt concerning whether we can actually survive by actually flowing and going with the waves, right? We can. And there's also the need to understand and to really see Holy Spirit as a part of those waves as well, right? We
Yep.
want to vilify them. That's not God, that's the devil. But what if it is God? What if it is a divine um wave or whatnot? And then the third one, capacity to minister to the broken. Like, I think the tendency is for the church to be reactive instead of proactive.
Yeah.
And we're already in this crisis. There's already been so many things that have not changed, that we have not allowed to change before coming into this pandemic. And now we have to be somewhat reactive, but we also need to be proactive. The ministry to the broken doesn't need to be something that we're preparing to do post COVID. It's something we need to do right now. There is no better time than now to for people to get rid of their hurt and pain and brokenness. When people are alone in their homes, they have time to contemplate. They have time to get back to the things that matter, their families, friendships, community building. Like, we have time, we have more time to put energy towards those things right now. And I think if anything, you know it becomes the role of the body of Christ to help people to return to those things, because that's where we find healing. Healing isn't something that you find in this individual journey. It is something you find in community,
Yeah.
with people, and you don't have to be touching that community to find it. So
Gotcha. Awesome. So moving right along. So here's a synopsis of a lot of what we just said. So Christian communities fail when they don't make use of proper technology, right? If your church does not know how to use technology, you better learn. You better learn, because I don't think we're ever going to go back to church as usual. Uh, and you need in your, not just churches but ministries in general, whether you're a prayer church organization or a nonprofit, you've got to be able to make proper use of technology. That's how you're going to touch people in the 21st century. um we got to understand how to be present. And if you don't if churches that don't understand how to be present, right, um and have a presence with people, right, you will fail, right? You will fail. You got to know what it means to not just be physically present, but to be emotionally available and ready to meet the needs of people, right? The emotional needs of people. And that's something that is easily said but not easily done, right? Not easily lived out. And it requires a missional refocus. This is a struggle for a lot of churches. Um, you know, especially the larger a church gets, sometimes, we tend to subconsciously move toward attraction the larger we get. And there's nothing wrong with attraction. But there needs to be a healthy balance between attraction and mission. And so really, really understanding how to be able to shift, right, and to be able to be available, right, to be adaptable, is going to be important. um, Folks now are not going to, they're going to go to churches that are able to meet their needs naturally, but spiritually those needs need to be met as well, right? The gospel needs to be presented to them in a way that is truly transformative in their life, right? um, Churches fail when Christian communities fail when we don't have a formula for measuring success outside of numbers and attendance. This is not a season where you can look and say, "Hey, we had such and such amount of people. Here's the numbers. You know, here's how many giving units we've had." All of those things are going to be, I mean, I won't say non-existent, but they're going to be less important. Um, Again, this just goes back to mission. You know, we've got to figure out how to bring measurement, because um, you know, anything that we're going to judge, we got to be able to measure, right? That is the first rule of training. um and it's true for this context as well. Anything that we're going to judge, anything that we're doing, we've got to be able to measure it, right? And measuring it is not always a quantitative thing, it's a qualitative thing. um you can't always do that by looking at the numbers. You can't do that by always looking at, okay, if we put this out, how much are we going to receive? um you've got to adopt more of a kingdom mindset. And I think that this season is the truest of all seasons. I think that we've got to adopt more of a kingdom mindset in order to be effective at what we're doing. um Christian communities fail when they are not given to mission or outreach. And this is true, like we've just talked about it. If you're not given to outreach, I think outreach in this case is really touching your community, right? Where you are geographically, or your target audience. Really being able to peer into that, to penetrate that segment of people, whether it be in your physical locale, or whether it be whether you're more of a lean organization and you operate online. You have to be able to do effective outreach, right? And outreach is so many different things. It's not just evangelism. A lot of times we say outreach is evangelism, bringing people to Christ. Yes, we want to bring people to Christ, but we also want to meet the needs of people. Like we said, folks are going to have needs in this season of life. And practicing that good Samaritan intentional love is going to be important. So refocusing. Um, Christian communities fail when they are not familiar with ministering to the needs of their people or community. And this is the exact same thing. We fail when we are not familiar. So many churches are used to gathering large masses of people, those people coming to church, putting on a concert or a performance or a service, and then those folks going home, right? Or teaching and preaching weekly, and then those folks going home, but not really ministering to the needs of those folks, right? Um, Community exegesis is going to be critical, right? Post COVID, it was critical pre COVID. It's critical now, but it's going to be even more critical post COVID. You've got to be able to do community exegesis. You've got to be able to figure out what are the needs of the people, what are the needs of your community, and then being able to minister to them, right? So think through these things. Anybody that's watching, if you're running a ministry, or if you are part of a ministry, or if you're running a parachurch organization, or whatever the case might be, these are the things that you really need to think through. How are we doing? Technology, presence, measurement. um, mission and outreach, and then community exegesis, meeting the needs of the people.
Yeah. So I have some thoughts and a question.
Hmm.
My first thought is I have something to add to this list.
Okay.
Communities fail when they are not making use of proper terminology.
Okay.
You know, I think this is the thing that we just haven't picked up on in a really long time, like hundreds of
Mm,
years. Like, centuries ago, it was very, very normal for Christian fathers or theologians or historians and scholars to come together, think through terminology, think through how to process the world in ways that meet their ideology, and then think about how they want to share that to communities. The
mm,
church is no longer a schoolhouse. We don't do those things anymore. And that's a problem.
yeah.
You know, how are we talking about the pandemic? What type of terminology are we tacking on to this pandemic? And is that terminology necessary? Does the pandemic have to be demonized in order for us to know that God is, here and present with us, pushing us through it, right?
Mm,
Like that kind of thing. And not only what the pandemic is, who was responsible, but how do we exist in it, while in it, and then how do we work towards existing when it is no longer an issue. A lot of people are saying, oh, I can't wait until things are normal. And I'm like, wait, you want to go back to how things were last year? I don't. Like, there are
right.
ways in which this pandemic needs to permanently change us. There are things that this pandemic has taught us about what we are lacking as a human race, what we are lacking as just mere humans, that we need to work on. Like the fact that we are not in effective communities.
Yeah.
That's something we need to consider. Or the fact that there's a lot of people who don't actually consider their neighbor. This is why we can walk around without masks. This is why we can still congregate and have hundreds of people in the same room, not 6 feet apart. This is why we still feel the need to go out and do our own thing and then go and hug our grandparents, right? We're not people centered, and we're not really intentional. We don't intentionally live out love in the ways that we ought to. So, proper terminology is key. Also, this is what the Hebrew Bible prophets are doing. So, you want to talk about like the prophetic, this is what they're doing. They're actually thinking about the past, or they're thinking about the present, and they're actually communicating what's happening. What's the role of the divine, what's the role of the human, and how do we think about this moving forward? That is the role of the prophets. So come on, there's some gaps.
Mm,
Let's
yeah.
fill those gaps as a body. But
Yeah. That's
another thing, oh, sorry, did you want to?
no. I was just gonna say that's good. That's good.
Yeah, I'm such a wordy person. I hear certain things and I'm like,
Yeah.
so that stood out to me. Another thing that I thought about was, shoot, and there was something here, and I didn't write it down like I wrote my question. Um, it was what you were talking about when you said community exegesis. And I wanted to explain to people what that is, because we think exegesis has everything to do with the Bible. Exegesis is actually a Greek word meaning to lead out, right? What we practice a lot of in the church is eisegesis, leading in, which means we're reading into text, into communities, into the world, what we want to see there. We're in so many ways telling it what it needs when you're leading out. And I love this word that you're using, or these cluster of words, community exegesis. It's meaning that you're allowing the community to lead out, the community to tell you what it needs, and that's just as important as eisegesis. Eisegesis has its place, but it should not have a place until proper exegesis is done.
Mm,
You're allowing that medium to tell you what it needs, right? You're to tell you what it means to communicate with you, and you not just simply telling it what its issue is and what it needs to be saying. So I thought that was great.
yeah.
My question, You've said this a few times. We need a formula for measuring success that's not quantitative, that doesn't think through attendance. How do we do it? How do we measure quality?
Okay. Um, we're gonna get into that.
Okay.
Now, if the end of this, if we still haven't got into it, then re-ask me. But I think that we got a slide that's coming up in just a second that's gonna kind of hit all of those points.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Um, so here are some top considerations for preaching and teaching. Um, I think that this is gonna go back to your previous point. Um, and if we don't hit it after this slide, let me know. But I believe we will. Top considerations for preaching and communication. For so this is for folks that are if you are navigating this online world, or even if you've been doing it, take these things into consideration. First off, um, we want to communicate often and as much as possible using all of our platforms, right? This includes, this is email, this is Facebook, this is Zoom, this is Instagram. However you are communicating with your folks, communicate with them as much and as often as possible. You're going to see different age groups of people use different platforms more often. Make sure you're communicating through all of those platforms, communicating about service, communicating encouragement, communicating your preaching, communicating it's just everything, right? A lot of churches and ministries fail during this time because the communication piece is lacking, because folks are not there. They can't physically hear the announcements. They don't know what's going on. So communication is going to be really, really, really important, right? Um, Intentionally embracing technology, right? Um, don't just accept the idea of it, right? And this goes back to that intentionality, right? Don't just say, oh, well, we need technology, so okay, we're gonna do this and that. And but there needs to be an excitement and an intention about embracing this technology, right? This is going to be vital to really to the success of I guess, if you can quote unquote say success of ministry in the long term. But definitely for the right now, we got to be intentional about embracing technology. That again is going to require a shifting and a changing of the mind. If you are intentional about embracing technology, then it's going to make your ministry operations much easier. It's going to make everything that you do much easier. It's going to make your preaching easier because you'll be able to touch more people, right? Be intentional about embracing technology, not just accepting of it, but be excited about it, be forward thinking about it. And think about not just the needs of today, but the needs of tomorrow, and move and act accordingly. um speak to the people beyond the camera. And I think this is kind of alluded to what you were saying earlier about making people feel like they're present in service. You want to speak to the people beyond the camera, right? You're not just talking to the couple of folks that are in the room, but you've got to imagine, picture, and see the person that's on the other side of the camera listening to the message, right? And preaching to them as if there were 1,000 people in the room, right? That's what we've got to get to. And I think that there's a way to get to that, right? Part of that is understanding that it really, here are a couple of things, right? First thing is understanding that um when you're preaching, you cannot just um, think that memorization is going to work, right? You've got to live that message. That message has to be ingrained in your heart. You've had to have had time to wrestle with what you're preaching, right? That is how your preaching becomes transformative. You've got to wrestle with it. It's got to be in you so much to the point where, or maybe all you need is a couple of bullet points. And then you've got to be able to see the people that are beyond the room, that the couple people that are in the room, and be able to speak to the hearts of the people that are sitting, they're sitting at their couch, or they're in their car, riding, and they've got you, on speaker. These are the things that are going to be really, really important, is practicing that piece of it. um, it- I can't tell you. how many preachers that I see preaching, or teachers that I see teaching, and they're preaching and teaching, or they're speaking, but it sounds like, it sounds like they're reading from a manuscript. you know a manuscript, by the way. And here's a point: manuscripts are not for online preaching and teaching. Okay. This is going to be difficult for some people because they're manuscript preachers, right? That is not an effective mode of communication for preaching and teaching online. What it's going to do is it's going to slowly null away at the engagement of the people that are engaging with your services, right? Manuscript, I'm going to say it again: manuscript preaching and reading word for word off of papers is not for online teaching and preaching. It may work for folks that are in your immediate surrounding. It may work for folks that are in the room with you. But if you're speaking to an online audience, that is not going to work. You are going to kill your own momentum. So speak to the people beyond the camera. Remember not to use manuscripts. That's going to require you to get the word deep down in your heart. Whatever you're preaching, you've got to know it so well until you can look at a bullet point and say, and begin to flow and speak about it, right? That's going to be key to really getting to the hearts of people, and really managing your content. And this isn't on the slide, but managing your content, knowing what to say and knowing what to preach, knowing how to deal, going past the surface and knowing how to deal with some of these real issues and these real things, right? These things are going to be key. If you are still preaching an hour, or if you're still preaching 45 minutes or 50 minutes, you are going, statistics show that you will have less engagement. Remember the 2/3 rule: less is more. If you've been preaching 45 minutes, you need to dial that thing down to like 30 minutes. I would even say 25, because people that are online, they'll listen for a minute, but they tap out immediately. It's not like sitting in a physical space. Being in a synchronous format, people's minds tend to veer off because they're already sitting in front of their phones. They're already sitting in front of their computers, or they're in front of the TV. If you're rambling on, it's not like they can just sit there. It's easy for me to get up and walk away. If I'm in church, I got to put, we do that finger and we go take a bathroom break every now and again. But for the most part, I'm sitting. If I'm at home, and the message is going too long, I'm not just gonna click out. I'm gonna go look at something else. I'm gonna change the channel, or I'm gonna go. And so this is gonna be vitally important. Say what you're going to say, but say it quick, fast, and in a hurry. You don't have to necessarily rush it through, but kill out all of the fluff and get to the meat of what you're saying. And less is more powerful. Preaching a 15-minute sermon that is right what people need is going to be much more effective than you writing this long intro and you're going through this long spiel and then you're pushing it out to 40 minutes. So remember the 2/3 rule, that less is more. These are some top considerations for preaching and teaching.
Yeah, these are really good. I do have a note with the manuscripts. A lot of people use manuscripts. Some people even pray. They write their prayer on paper and then they will pray that. Um, I'm one of those people. I don't actually find it really helpful to write lecture notes verbatim and to read them.
Yeah.
I'm one of the bullet point people as well. But everyone's not like that. And so I think in one way or another, it is really important that there's a little bit of a balance too. There are people out there who feel a lot more comfortable with manuscripts, and in that case, it might just mean learning how to transition your manuscripts into an effective bullet point list, and therefore working on how to take that very detailed bullet point list and communicate it in a way that does not suggest that you're reading from your notes. And it's a skill that you develop over time. It's not something that happens overnight. um, Another thing that I thought about, because for some people it's really easy to just sit here and talk, right? Especially when it is in the area in which they are an expert in. You ask me about the Hebrew Bible, I can sit here and talk about about the Hebrew Bible for ages. Like, and it doesn't even matter. It almost doesn't matter what you bring up in the Hebrew Bible. I can just discuss it like it is the, a part of my body, but you asked me something about, I don't know, Java, some kind of cute computer programming. I can tell you a tad about it, but at some point, my communication is going to end fairly early, right? And if I had to deliver a lecture on that, I probably would have a lot more of a leaning on notes, right? So we do have those moments, and the reason why I felt the need to make this point is because there are some tough conversations that church leaders need to be able to have with their people. And they are uncomfortable topics that church leaders might not feel as though they are experts with or concerning. And it's okay to use your notes.
Yeah.
It's okay to use, in that case, use a manuscript of some kind. Just learn how to communicate your manuscript effectively, because we got to talk about this really uncomfortable stuff. One of the things we were talking about a few days ago was sexuality. We got to have that tough conversation. And I almost guarantee you that the stuff we were talking about, the terminology we were using, most church leaders don't even know about that stuff.
Yeah.
We still got people saying boy, girl, trans instead of cis male, cis woman, trans male, trans woman. That's the proper terminology. There's no such thing in this society as girl, boy, trans, right? That's not a thing. So that kind of thing. Not only that, but we need to have tough conversations, digging into the Bible. We have to be able to talk about these tensions that are there, because they're there and they're screaming aloud to us. How to think about technological advances in a society where we have YouTube prophets claiming that the vaccine is the mark of the beast.
Yeah.
You make sense of that? Like, you get what I'm saying? Like, how do you communicate effectively and rid people of this fear that, the technological world in some ways is making a lot more accessible to people? These are topics that a lot of people won't feel really comfortable talking about. And so don't I would highly encourage people to not be afraid of the manuscript. Some of us need to write them, but find a way to simplify the manuscript in a way that allows you to just have a conversation with people. And sometimes it means being able to throw away your manuscript when it is no longer necessary for the conversation. So one of the things that I try to teach instructors with ABI, and we're planning on having a more thorough training on this, is, we create lecture notes, we create these beautiful PowerPoints, but we want to encourage dialogue. And if students are asking questions related to the subject area, and that answer is not on your PowerPoint, you might have to throw away a slide or two. Because the purpose of the classroom is for us to have transformative dialogue, and we can't do that if the instructor is so set on trying to get through all 10 slides of his or her PowerPoint. That doesn't quite work. So learning how when to put away your manuscript helps. Maybe we can have a class or a webinar teaching these effective methods of put using tools and being able to put tools away when it comes to really trying to engage community. My
Mm.
next thing was, I still got the question.
Okay.
How do we actually how do we measure that we are effective in doing these 5 things that you've placed here on the slide? How
Yeah.
do we what's the formula?
Yeah. And I want to go back to the manuscript thing, and I think you put it excellent, because I what I was suggesting was not that um a person shouldn't have manuscripts at all, but there's a certain for many preachers there's a certain monotone, and there's a certain disconnect from the audience, or there's a certain disconnect from the feeling of the message, right? That can sometimes bring about not touching people's hearts. So not that manuscripts are all bad, but there is a way to do things, and I think kind of toning down on it is the part. But I think that you articulated that great. Um, in terms of measuring these things, I think some of it is less measurable than others, but most of it you'll see a change when you start doing intentional practice. When you start doing intentional practice of communication, for example, look at your engagement, right? Look at your engagement over the course of a month span or a 2 month span. um when you start practicing intentional communication on all of your platforms, look at the results, right? Look at some of your results. What are some of the things that you were measuring previously? Were you measuring how many views you had? Were you measuring, this or that, how many comments, things of that nature? When you start doing intentional communication, you can look at the total, you can look at your total engagement, right? And you should start seeing some peaks, right? All right, did your engagement go up 10%, 20%, 30%? These are some of the things that you need to do when you practice intentional technology, right? Also look at the engagement. You might see your online presence slowly creep up. You might see your your organizational operations, right, or your church operations might flow a lot more, more smoothly. um these are all things that will happen in time. In the beginning there will be a learning curve, so it may not seem easier in the beginning, but eventually you should start seeing things begin to level off. You should start seeing things happen for you more easily. Really, the biggest measure is going to be figuring out your engagement, right? And sometimes that requires people of certain skill sets, maybe especially if you are at least a decently sizable church. That requires people doing various kinds of analyses, really being intentional about um, focusing on how many people you're touching, right? Um, I tell people all the time, it's okay to look at views, but views don't really measure how many people you're really touching, right? It just shows you like how many people scrolled for at least 5 seconds, right, into your message, because people might have listened to you for 10 seconds and not gotten anything out of what you said and then scroll right past it. That could be because maybe your head was down the whole time you were preaching from a manuscript. You didn't feel what you were saying. But there are ways to bring measurement. So not just views, but look at your comments, right? When you're doing this thing right, people should be commenting, right? We should also be surveying, right? Surveying. So we have a think and change management. Whenever there's a change that comes about, there is a way to do assessment, right? There are people in your congregation that you should be able to go to a percentage of your congregation or even the majority of your congregation, and you should be able to blast out assessments. Hey, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong as it pertains to our online presence, right? And I think that many times churches don't do that. They just slap something up there. And so what happens is they have less engagement and they don't know it. People will come in and they'll tune in for a couple seconds, but when you get to the meat of what it is that you want to talk about, they're not listening, they're not engaging. So I think that there are ways, and I think that the biggest way, the biggest thing that I can say is to peer beyond just slapping something up there and preaching, but really engaging people that are beyond the camera or behind the camera. And the way to do that is to utilize the technology. So that can be sending out surveys, that could be doing an assessment, that could be asking for feedback, um, watching how many times your stuff has been shared, right? if you have if you have 1,000 views and it's only been shared once or twice, that's an issue. Or if it's only been shared 4 times, that's an issue. If you have 1,000 views, you're likely touching many more people if your stuff has been shared 40 times or 50 times, because people are knowing people that you don't know. Those people are knowing folks that you don't know. The more shares that you're getting, right? the more likely it is that you're touching more people. So I think thinking innovatively about these things and really using an organizational development concept, which is going to be engaging folks that are, I guess, quote unquote, at the bottom with operations and decisions that you make at the top, especially in this season, is going to really, really, really boost your engagement.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I think we can kind of learn from the educational world here. And so I want to provide some of those measurements as well, because one thing that is really, really tricky is the way that technology measures things.
Yeah.
Um, how much of a video on Facebook, for example, does a person need to watch in order for it to count as a view?
Mhm.
If they only got to watch a minute and your session was an hour long, and that doesn't actually constitute a really good view, right?
Yeah.
And so I think also understanding that, and in that case understanding that sometimes technology brings about the air of engagement, like a this idea of engagement that's kind of false.
Mhm.
And so staying away from the numbers, not completely ignoring them, because numbers do matter, but the numbers of likes, the numbers of comments, the numbers of views, all those things are according to a formula, and that formula might not be effective in really helping you gauge the
Exactly.
quality of content, especially when most Facebook videos are quite short, but when a church service is not, it's not short at all.
Yeah.
So the formula that's in Facebook, for example, or YouTube might actually not work for webinars as long as this, for example. So I think quantitative or qualitative measurement is going to be more effective. And what we do in schools, anonymous surveys. Every class concludes with an anonymous survey that is sent to students, and students complete this survey, and you don't know who submitted the survey. I mean, sometimes you can figure it out by the quality of the comment,
Mhm.
because that person complained to you before, something like that, or they made that comment to you before. But having anonymous surveys generally eliminates that, and it removes the ability of the student to be honest, or excuse me, dishonest from the equation. So you're able to get a more honest review when it's anonymous. In addition to that, Zoom has a polling option, so you can actually, not only does this increase your engagement, but it makes sure that in one way or another, it gives you an idea as to how many people are actually actively looking at your session or your church service or your webinar or whatever it is online, and engaging with the system itself by you asking questions through Zoom, polling the answers, and then figuring out how many people are actually responding.
Mhm.
Some of us be washing our hair during church services. It's me. Hair days is Sundays, and I love my church, but for some reason, like, I'm not a person that actively engages on Facebook in itself. I barely comment, I really only advertise, and so I can still hear the service while washing my hair. I'm multitasking almost
Mhm.
all the time. It is so natural for me, so much so that I have to think about the extent to which I am being present in every meeting. I have to do that work for myself, because I'm constantly multitasking. It's been my life for 30 plus years. So um that will probably get at those types of issues, right?
Yeah.
In addition to that, the quality of comments. So, not calculating how many comments, but the quality. And I think you mentioned this, Cord. Like, if people are actually putting in comments things that correspond with your message, that helps,
Yeah.
right? Even the number of shares can be misleading, right? Because some people just share because they heard you say, share this.
Mhm.
Support this church, right? Let you press the share button, but the share doesn't really always constitute a quality of service. So what's the difference between support and quality of service? What's the difference between someone supporting you and someone sharing your stuff because they believe that everyone on their friends list or someone in their friends list can benefit from you and from what you're sharing? Those are two different things. Another thing I would say is be honest. ask honest questions to the group. Be honest. How was this? Be Tell me the truth, I want to know how I can make this better. And students and church folk, they'll give you some feedback. Good things and bad things, especially if you present this in an environment that is personal in so many ways, and you can do that virtually. um I'm teaching this class again, or I'm next week we're doing this platform again. I want to know how I can make it better. I want to know how I can make this more personal, and allow people to give you good advice. And lastly, I think one thing that the church can benefit from educational institutions is an intake program. Um, this has been in my mind for years, and I've always wondered why churches don't do it. Right? You go to college, and one of the first things that you do is you get an advisor
Mm-hmm.
who follows you through your matriculation until you are given over to an advisor in your field or in your department or whatnot. This is one thing that could be very, very helpful for churches. Not only will it relieve leaders of stress and pressure, but it will also make sure that you are elevating leaders or elevating people, and it will make sure that you are able to satisfy the needs of individual groups and individual people or persons in your church. When people come in, have intake officers who won't just take their name and information, but once they join, who will actually have consultations with them, 15, 20-minute consultations. Why are you joining this church? What do you expect from us? What can we do for you? That kind of thing. And also, what do you want to do for this church? Those kind of questions. And having that person, if not that person, using that intake process to pair that person with a leader or a minister that will check in periodically every so often, making sure that you're living up to expectations, because people have expectations when they walk into churches.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes, sadly, people leave without those expectations having been satisfied. But if we had an intake process, not only will it help in putting people in groups of people who are like minded, who might be great support for that person, like you can have C groups with that community group coming together. You can also utilize that community group in so many ways, and put them through or have them complete surveys or give suggestions and gauge how effective you are as a ministry in that one little group. So I think having some kind of intake process could be really helpful. And in times like this, if you had 10 people to a leader in your church, checking in through text message, email, or a phone call every so often wouldn't be so hectic. you know you
Mm-hmm.
reach out, hey, how you doing? Is there anything you would like prayer for or regarding? Is there anything we can help you with? Those kind of questions. And also just being real and candid, like, how are you really doing? Really getting the lowdown on people, not all their info, but showing that you're personable and that you're really interested in their lives, not being that, not that, how you doing, I'm okay, period kind of thing, right? But yeah, I think all of these will be great educational tools that will be helpful in a church.
Awesome sauce. Awesome sauce. Great stuff. Great stuff.
So
Okay.
I
We can
think
hit
we're
right. So yeah, just some so this is kind of really just this is kind of piggybacking off a lot of what has already come out, but just some tops of considerations for community and vitality. So we did tops of considerations for preaching and communications. These are tops considerations for community and vitality. Um, so again, doing that exegesis, that community exegesis, right? Do research to find out who is in need, right? So you need to know who's in need, and then do research to find out the greatest needs. So who's in need and what do they need, right? What is a cluster? Um, in this COVID-19 era and then beyond, if we want to missionally refocus, who needs what, right? Who's in need? What do they need? In terms of your members, church members, in terms of your the community and your immediate geographical space, the people that are a part of your online community, or they subscribe to your or to your online community, or they're frequent visitors. You need to know who they are, you need to know what they need, and you need to know what are the greatest needs of these people, and then figuring out a way to meet these needs. So one and two are really really entwined. This is really 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 what it means to live out the the missional and outreach concept. um, to be a ministry of presence, right? Learning how to be present with people, right? And so one and two kind of leads into three. But even if it's not meeting tangible needs, sometimes those emotional needs are important. So learning how to be present and focusing on having a ministry of presence with people is going to be key and vital. This is how you're not only going to do effective ministry, but this is how you'll keep folks engaged. This is how people become lifelong members to churches. Is when churches can meet their emotional needs. And this is sadly something that we talk about, but it's not something that we can always do. It's very much so much easier to talk about and to theorize, um, than to actually live into and actually do, and put something that we can really put mobility to. But these are the conversations that we need to be having with our leadership teams. And if it requires a complete refocus, it requires a complete refocus. But online, just online enough is not going to do it. You've got to be able to be intentional. Online services, you got to be able to be intentional about touching people, equipping and empowering people. As you move through one, two, and three, number four, equipping and empowering people is going to be vital, because one or two people are not going to be able to do it alone. And I think that Latoya was just alluding to this. You've got to know how to pass the baton and how to train and I think raise up people and raise up leaders and empower those folks to touch people, right? She was talking about that intake process. um you can't, the problem is that if you have a very centralized power system, it's going to be very hard to do intake. It's going to be very hard. It's going to be very hard to touch all of the people that you're meant to touch if your church has a centralized power system. So what does that mean? The pastor does everything. The pastor makes all the decisions. The pastor does this. Oh, the elder board does this. The elder board does that. The elder board is in charge. The elder board makes. If your church is centralized like that, and you're not training volunteers, and you're not raising up lay people, and you're not equipping other people to do, I guess in some circles, quote unquote, licensed ministry work, you're going to have a hard time living out a missional community. You're going to have a hard time with training folks, and you're going to have a hard time with keeping people. You probably would even have a hard time with having a non-traditional church, or operating in churches, or operating in a space that is required, now, that non-traditional space that we need. You have a difficult time. So equipping and empowering people is going to be really important. Training those folks, developing them, and then giving them the authority and the autonomy to make decisions, right? And trusting them within this space. These are the things that you need to consider if you want to have a growing and vibrant ministry during these times. um Number five, be a place that is concerned about, again, this is what Latoya said, quality more than quantity. Okay. Quantity is important, right? But quality is going to be more important. Okay. Here's what I mean. It's great if you can touch 1,000 people. It's great if you can touch 2,000. But it's more important if you can be effective to the 75 than it is, providing minuscule services to the 1,000. Quality is what's going to draw, not just draw people, but also keep them. And when I say keep them, I don't mean just keep them at your ministry, but I mean keep them with hope, with faith, and it's going to strengthen their relationship with God, right? Quality. So going back to that effective preaching, right? Um, Ministering to things that minister to the heart of people, right? We talk about programming and services, being missional and being intentional about doing community exegesis, about touching people, about reaching them, and not just reaching them for the sake of evangelism, but reaching them for the sake of the Good Samaritan, right? Reaching them for the sake of touching and meeting their needs, right? Physical and emotionally. Right. These are going to be some of the most pertinent issues that we're dealing with during this time of pandemic, right? So look at your communities, look and see what they need. What do the people need? Do you have people in your community whose businesses are closed down? Do you have people in your communities who need financial literacy? Do you have people in your communities who they've had the death of a loved one due to the pandemic? What is going on in your immediate surroundings that you need to address? And how many people are dealing with these same issues? Are these issues across the board? Are these issues considered to be widespread? Are 30% of the folks that you're engaging with, are they dealing with this? These are the things that you need to not just be preaching about, but these are the things that you need to be figuring out. How can I mitigate this problem? How can I bring solution to? Right? Quality over quantity. Right. And that is all. That's all I got. So these have been some of our top considerations for community building in the time of the pandemic during COVID-19. Feel free to follow us at Modern Bible Institute. Follow us on Facebook and all of our other platforms. You can check us out at modernbibleinstitute.net. And I'm going to turn it over to our illustrious founder and president, Latoya Leary.
Hi. So thank you for that, Professor Cord. That was excellent. I just want to go through some of the things that ABI is offering this winter and spring of 2021. So we really believe this to be a season of emergence for all people, really, and nations. And so we want to make sure that we're speaking to that need and that we are arming people with every bit of information and all resources that they would need to not only spiritually grow, but so that they can grow in biblical literacy. So in term one and 1A, and that's the only term I'm going to discuss today, but we do have four terms for the spring classes starting as early as January and ending as late as May. We have about a course every single month. So if you wanted to be a month to month student or you wanted to use us, Amana Bible Institute, as your monthly educational institute, as a lifelong institution for you, we can be that. Um, so in term one, we are offering quite a few classes for you. We're offering 8-week courses, one in Introduction to Old Testament. And we're going to focus on the Torah. So the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. That course is going to meet on Saturdays for an hour and a half. It is 8 weeks, so it will end in March. And we're also offering an Introduction to New Testament. This will focus on Pauline literature, taught by Professor Onika Stewart. That course is going to meet on Mondays, and it's actually going to meet for an hour and a half, so 7 to 8:30, that should say, starting at on January 10th. In term 1A, all of these courses also starting January 10th. They're 1 hour courses that meet for 4 weeks, so one session every week. We have prophetic artistry 101 that meets on Thursdays. Prophetic artistry is all about, at least the first part is all about you. We're going to be talking about how to use our art forms or your creative writing forms or your theater forms or mediums to actually work through personal healing. And then we'll have 102 later on in the year, which will discuss how you can use your art form to heal a targeted community. We're also offering gospel parables, which will meet Tuesdays. Um, Professor Onika Stewart will be talking about the parables of the first 4 books of the New Testament. So All of these parables are taught, they're teachings of Jesus. So the course will heavily focus on some of the key teachings of Jesus. And then last but not least, we have Professor Cord here, who you've just had this great conversation with. He will be teaching marketplace ministry Saturdays at 10 a.m. All of these courses start the week of January 10th. We do have promotions for you. So, our Emerge 2021 sale gives you 10% off of monthly subscriptions, which is pretty good. And you get that as long as you are in the monthly subscriptions. You can cancel the monthly subscriptions at any time. Um, and we have them in place on our website that allows you to enroll in one course a month, two courses a month, or three courses a month. We also have 20% off of our certificate programs. So if you're interested in getting a biblical studies or biblical languages or even Christian ministry certificate, you can go ahead and get that 20% off, which is a pretty hefty discount. We do offer monthly plans and payments. And I believe this puts a few of our subscription plans at about $48 a month. So that's a pretty great price to pay monthly for a certificate. We do have basic and advanced certificates. In this case, our basic certificates require about 5 courses, and then our advanced about 8 courses. And they're great plans. You can take 6 months to a year to complete them, and you can actually take your time completing them. Though, if you want to get a Christian ministry certificate, which allows you to plug and play a lot of our personal development and spiritual development courses in there, you can actually get that 20% off and complete it in just one semester. So you can start classes in January and classes in May, and you can actually get all 5 courses done within that 5 month period. So um, take advantage of that if you're interested. And last but not least, we have a 50% off biblical languages course promotion. What we're doing is we will require that you enroll in our biblical languages primer course, which will start in term 2, so in February. And what we'll do is we'll push your $60 enrollment fee into your biblical languages fee. So you'll just have to pay half for the biblical language. And the primer course is great. It's just going to prepare you to learn the alphabet and some of the basic terminology or the basics of learning a biblical language for Hebrew and Greek. And then you'll be able to choose the language that you want to enroll in and start your language learning progression there. Our language learning courses are great in that we don't require a whole lot of memorization. We just want to arm you with every bit of tool that you need to learn how to read a grammar book, read a Hebrew or a Greek Bible, or text, and utilize lexicons and dictionaries, things of that nature to do the work of translation. So long as you if you don't have the best memory, you're fine. You just need to really be able to memorize the basics, alphabet, vowel system, and maybe one or two other things, and then you'll be completely fine for the rest of the term. Last but not least, we do have 5 webinar series for you. We have a Personal Growth Matters webinar series where we have 6 sessions for you. One of those sessions we will have this coming Tuesday at 6 p.m. Go ahead and register. It's completely free. And it's taught by Professor El Michelle. She is great, and you're going to learn about immersive journaling. It's actually a tool that she herself created, and it's great. So please do register for that. It is free. In addition to that, there's a ministry and social change webinars, one of which you did today. We're just concluding today. The other will take place in February, Ethics, the Church in the Marketplace. We have 2 webinars that's in our Marketplace Ministry section, one of these being in January. Do register. These are free. Last but not least, we have a Real Talks webinar where we're just going to have informal conversations. And yes, conversations. We're not bringing any PowerPoints. We're not bringing any worksheets. We're just thinking on these topics, coming together, and dumping our brains. That's it. And you can come and dump your brain too. And we're going to try to pick up the pieces and actually make sense and try to move all of us forward as we consider things like the anointing, God and the gender of God, the plurality of God. We're going to really try to think through these things, bringing just our Bibles and whatever we have in our minds um, to the table. And we have a hashtag interpretation matters webinar, one of which will occur just 1 week from now, where I'm going to be teaching rereading OT narratives. We're going to be talking about how to rethink about the Old Testament. We're going to be thinking about how we can reread Old Testament narratives in ways that are transformative and in ways that move society forward, that moves the body of Christ forward. And then we're going to do the same thing with the New Testament the Tuesday after. Professor Onika Stewart is going to do that with the Pauline epistles for you. And last but not least, in January, we're going to be talking about the importance of translation. So we're going to be gearing up and preparing you for our Bible languages primer course, why we need to all take part in the work of translation. We do have a spring open house, so if you're interested in meeting us, learning more about our classes, learning more about our promotions, and signing up for complimentary spiritual or academic counseling, come to our open house free of charge. It will be on Zoom, but then we'll also give you the option to sign up for a complimentary counseling session with one of your instructors. So if interested, just go to our website and register. You can register at www.amanabibleinstitute.net. Anything else, Professor Cord?
No, I am all set. Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Well, thank you so much for the lesson. It was great, and I hope you guys have a great day.